The boardroom fell silent. Vivian Ashford, CEO of one of the largest automotive firms in the country, stood frozen as the quiet man in worn jeans sketched a solution her entire engineering department had failed to produce in 6 months. He wasn't supposed to be here. 24 hours ago, he'd been fixing her car on a deserted highway, refusing her money, asking only for a sandwich so he could pick up his daughter from school. Now he was rewriting her company's future on a whiteboard while her executives stared in disbelief. But what Vivian didn't know yet was that this wasn't just about engineering brilliance or corporate success. This was about a man who had buried himself alive after tragedy, and a woman who had never learned how to be human until she met him. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this journey takes us. Now, let me tell you how it all began. The highway stretched empty in both directions, heat shimmering off the asphalt like something out of a fever dream. Vivian Ashford stood beside her silver Aston Martin, arms crossed, heels sinking slightly into the gravel shoulder. Her phone showed no signal. Of course it didn't. This godforsaken stretch of Route 9 had probably been forgotten by cellular providers the same year it had been forgotten by the Department of Transportation. She checked her watch. 7:47 a.m. The board meeting started at 9:30. She had exactly 1 hour and 43 minutes to get back to the city, and her car, her beautiful, pristine, absurdly expensive car, sat dead as a doornail with its hood propped open like a broken promise. Unbelievable, she muttered, yanking off her blazer and tossing it through the open window onto the passenger seat. The morning sun was already brutal, and her silk blouse wasn't doing much to help. She'd left the city at 6:15 thinking she'd beat traffic, maybe even have time to review the merger documents one more time before the meeting. Instead, she was stranded on a highway that looked like it hadn't seen another vehicle since the Clinton administration. Vivian wasn't used to things going wrong. Her entire life had been built on control, precision, and the careful elimination of variables. She'd clawed her way to the top of Ashford Dynamics by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everyone around her. She didn't do helpless. She didn't do stranded. But here she was. She walked around to the front of the car again, staring down at the engine like it might suddenly confess what it had done wrong. Wires and metal and mysterious fluids that all looked perfectly fine to her untrained eye. She'd tried restarting it 4 times. The engine wouldn't even turn over, just a clicking sound that made her want to throw something. A truck appeared in the distance, coming from the opposite direction. Vivian straightened, hope flickering briefly before she reminded herself that hope was a useless emotion. The truck was old, faded blue paint and a dented front bumper, moving at a speed that suggested its driver had nowhere important to be. As it got closer, she saw it start to slow. Then it pulled onto the shoulder across from her, tires crunching on gravel, and came to a stop. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing jeans that had seen better days and a gray t-shirt that fit him like he'd bought it at a hardware store without bothering to check the size. His hair was dark, slightly too long, and he had the kind of face that was hard to read. Strong jaw, serious eyes, the look of someone who didn't waste energy on expressions he didn't mean. He crossed the highway toward her, moving with an easy confidence that somehow didn't come off as cocky, just capable. "Car trouble?" he asked when he reached her. Vivian resisted the urge to say something cutting. "It won't start. I don't know what's wrong with it." He glanced at the Aston Martin, then back at her. "You try calling for a tow?" "No signal." She held up her phone as evidence. He nodded, like this was exactly what he'd expected. "Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest." He moved to the front of the car, leaning over the engine with the kind of focus that suggested he actually knew what he was looking at. Vivian watched him, trying not to feel completely useless. She was good at a lot of things. Cars were not one of them. "When did it die?" he asked, not looking up. "About 20 minutes ago. I was driving, everything was fine, and then it just stopped. I managed to coast here before it gave out completely." "Any warning lights?" "No." He reached in, touched something, frowned. His hands were scarred, small nicks and old burns, the kind you got from years of working with tools and engines. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "You got anywhere you need to be?" he asked after a moment. "A board meeting in the city in less than 2 hours." "That's tight." I'm aware. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. Your fuel pump's shot. That's why it won't turn over. I can fix it, but I don't have the part on me. Vivian felt something cold settle in her chest. How long would it take to get the part? If I call it in now, maybe an hour, then another 30 minutes to install it. You'd be cutting it close. That's not going to work. He shrugged. Your other option is to wait for a tow, but out here that could take twice as long. She closed her eyes, doing the math. There was no version of this that got her to the meeting on time. And this wasn't just any meeting. This was the meeting. The one where she'd spent the last 6 months positioning herself to push through a merger that would double the company's market share and cement her legacy as the CEO who turned Ashford Dynamics into an industry titan. And she was going to miss it because of a fuel pump. Actually, the man said, I've got a universal pump in my truck. It won't be a perfect match, but it'll get you to the city. Vivian opened her eyes. You carry spare fuel pumps in your truck? I carry a lot of things. He was already walking back toward his vehicle. She followed, her heels clicking on the asphalt. His truck was even more beat up close, with tools scattered in the bed and what looked like a child's backpack wedged behind the driver's seat. He pulled out a metal toolbox, rummaged through it, and came up with a small component that looked vaguely mechanical. This'll work, he said. Give me 15 minutes. I can pay you, Vivian said quickly. Whatever you want. He glanced at her, and for the first time, something that might have been amusement crossed his face. I'm not doing this for money. Then why are you doing it? Because you're stuck, and I can help. He walked back to her car, and Vivian stood there feeling like she'd just been gently put in her place. She was used to transactions, used to people wanting something from her. This man didn't seem to want anything at all, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. She watched him work. He moved with a kind of quiet precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation. He didn't talk, didn't ask her to hand him tools or hold anything, just worked in silence, the minutes ticking by while the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down on both of them. At one point she asked, Do you do this for a living? Fixing cars? Sometimes. That's not really an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She wanted to push, but something about the set of his shoulders told her it wouldn't get her anywhere. So she waited, checking her watch every 2 minutes, her anxiety ratcheting higher with each passing moment. Finally, he straightened up. Try it now. Vivian slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Relief flooded through her so fast it almost made her dizzy. She got out, and he was already packing up his tools. Thank you, she said, and meant it. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. You'd have figured something out. Maybe. She reached into her car, grabbed her purse, pulled out her wallet. Please, let me give you something. He shook his head. I don't need your money. Then what do you need? He paused, looked at her like he was considering the question seriously. You got any food? I skipped breakfast. Vivian blinked. Food? Yeah, sandwich, protein bar, whatever you've got. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she reached into the back seat and pulled out the insulated bag her assistant had packed that morning. A croissant, some fruit, a turkey sandwich she'd been planning to eat in the car. She held out the sandwich. This work? He took it, nodded. Thanks. That's it? A sandwich? I've got to pick up my daughter from school later. This'll save me a stop. And just like that, the moment shifted. He wasn't just some stranger who'd helped her. He was a father. Someone with a life that had nothing to do with her, someone who'd taken 15 minutes out of his day to fix her car because that's just who he was. Well, Vivian said, feeling strangely off balance. Thank you, really. Drive safe, he said, and walked back to his truck. She stood there for a moment watching him go. Then she got in her car, pulled back onto the highway, and drove toward the city as fast as she dared. She made it to the meeting with 4 minutes to spare. The boardroom was exactly as she'd left it 2 days ago. Long polished table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, 16 leather chairs occupied by the most powerful people in the automotive industry. Vivian took her seat at the head of the table, and the room settled into the kind of attentive silence that always preceded her presentations. She ran the meeting with her usual precision. Slides, data, projections. She walked them through every angle of the merger, anticipated every question, dismantled every objection before it could fully form. By the time she finished, the vote was a formality. 14 in favor, 2 abstentions, no one against. It should have felt like a victory. It was a victory. But as she stood there accepting congratulations and fielding follow-up questions, her mind kept drifting back to the highway, to the man with the scarred hands and the quiet competence, to the way he'd refused her money and asked for a sandwich instead. She didn't even know his name. That night, Vivian sat in her apartment, a penthouse overlooking the river, all glass and steel and carefully curated minimalism, and tried to focus on the stack of contracts her legal team had sent over. But she kept thinking about him. It wasn't attraction, or at least it wasn't just attraction, it was something else. A nagging sense that she'd missed something important, that the man who'd fixed her car wasn't who he appeared to be. She opened her laptop, pulled up the company's internal database, and started searching. She didn't have much to go on. A first name would have been helpful, but she had the location, the time, the type of truck. And Vivian hadn't become CEO by accepting gaps in information. It took her 3 hours and 2 glasses of wine, but she found him. Ethan Cole. The file was thin, which was strange in itself. Most people left digital footprints everywhere. Ethan's was barely a smudge, but what was there made her sit up straighter. 7 years ago, Ethan Cole had been one of the most promising automotive engineers in the country. Patents under his name. Breakthrough designs for electric drivetrains. Articles in trade journals calling him the future of the industry. And then, nothing. No new patents, no publications, no job history at any of the major firms. He just disappeared. Vivian dug deeper. Found an obituary from 6 years ago. Emily Cole, beloved wife and mother, died unexpectedly at 31, survived by her husband Ethan and daughter Sophie. She sat back, staring at the screen. He'd lost his wife, and he'd walked away from everything. Bam. The next morning, Vivian did something she almost never did. She cleared her schedule. Then she drove back out to Route 9. It took her most of the day to find him. She stopped at gas stations, diners, auto shops, asking if anyone knew a man named Ethan Cole who drove an old blue pickup. Most people shook their heads. A few pointed her in vague directions. Finally, a woman at a roadside diner told her he sometimes worked out of a garage about 10 miles west. The garage was barely more than a shed with a roll-up door, tucked behind a mechanic's shop that looked like it had been there since the 70s. Vivian pulled up, got out, and walked inside. Ethan was there, bent over the engine of a sedan that had seen better days. He didn't look up when she entered. "We're closed," he said. "I'm not here for car repair." He straightened, turned, and his expression shifted when he saw her. Surprise, maybe, or wariness. "You," he said. "Me." Vivian stepped closer. "I wanted to thank you again, for yesterday." "You already thanked me." "I know. But I also wanted to ask you something." He wiped his hands on a rag, waited. "Why did you stop doing what you were good at?" she asked. His face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Ethan Cole. Patents for electric drivetrain innovations. Published research on energy-efficient automotive systems. You were one of the top engineers in the field, and then you just vanished." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You did your homework." "I always do." "Then you know why I stopped." "I know you lost your wife. I don't know why that meant losing everything else." Something hard flashed in his eyes. "You don't know anything about it." "You're right," Vivian said. "I don't. But I do know talent when I see it, and I saw it yesterday when you fixed my car in 15 minutes like it was nothing." "It was nothing." "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't." He turned away, set the rag down on the workbench. "Why are you here?" "Because I want to offer you a job." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A job. At Ashford Dynamics, head of engineering development. You'd have a team, resources, the kind of budget most engineers would kill for." "I'm not interested." "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to." He looked at her, and his expression was harder now. "I left that world for a reason. I'm not going back. Even if it means using your skills for something that matters, even if it means—" "I have a daughter," he said, cutting her off. "She's 6 years old, and she's been through enough. I'm not putting her through more just so I can chase some career I don't want anymore." Vivian felt the words land like a slap. "I'm not asking you to abandon her. No. You're asking me to go back to 80-hour weeks and late nights and missing school plays because there's always one more problem to solve. I did that before. It cost me everything. I'm not doing it again. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wasting himself, that he could do so much more than fix cars on the side of the highway, but the look on his face stopped her. Okay, she said finally. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come. She turned to leave, and his voice stopped her at the door. Why does it matter to you? She looked back. What? Why does it matter if I take the job or not? You've got a whole company full of engineers. Why do you care about one guy who fixes cars? Vivian thought about it, about the way he'd helped her without expecting anything in return, about the intelligence in his eyes and the precision in his hands and the way he'd built a life around his daughter, because that was what mattered most. Because I think you're extraordinary, she said, and I think you've forgotten that. She left before he could respond. Bob. For the next 3 weeks, Vivian threw herself into work. The merger went through. The stock price climbed. Her board was thrilled. Her investors were thrilled, and she should have been thrilled. But she kept thinking about Ethan. She told herself it was just professional interest. She'd spotted talent, and it had gotten away. That was all. But late at night, when the city lights glittered below her apartment and the silence pressed in too close, she knew it was more than that. She'd spent her whole life building walls, being the smartest person in the room, winning every argument, every negotiation, every battle. And in the process, she'd forgotten what it felt like to meet someone who didn't want anything from her, who looked at her like she was just a person who needed help, not a title or a bank account or a stepping stone. Ethan had helped her because that's who he was, and she didn't know what to do with that. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Vivian was in her office, reviewing quarterly projections, when her assistant buzzed through. There's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. Tell him to schedule one. He said his name is Ethan Cole. Vivian's hand froze on the mouse. Send him in. The door opened and Ethan walked in looking exactly like he had the first time she'd met him. Jeans, t-shirt, the same quiet intensity. But there was something different in his expression now, something uncertain. I'll stand, he said when she gestured to the chairs across from her desk. Okay. He shoved his hands in his pockets, looked around the office like he was trying to figure out how to start. Finally, he said, My daughter asked me what I used to do. Before. Vivian waited. I told her I was an engineer, that I designed things that made cars better, and she asked me why I stopped. He met Vivian's eyes. I didn't have a good answer. What did you tell her? That I wanted to spend more time with her, which is true, but it's not the whole truth. He paused. The whole truth is that I was scared. After Emily died, I couldn't handle going back to that life. It felt like too much. So I walked away, and I told myself it was for Sophie, but really it was because I couldn't face it. Vivian felt something twist in her chest. Ethan, I'm not done. He took a breath. Sophie told me I should go back. She said if I was good at it, I should do it. And that made me think about your offer. The job. Yeah. He looked uncomfortable, like this was costing him something. If it's still on the table, I'd like to hear the details. Vivian stood slowly, came around the desk. It's still on the table, but I need you to know what you'd be walking into. Tell me. We're in the middle of a major shift. The merger brought in new tech, new teams, new challenges. My head of engineering just quit because he couldn't handle the pressure. We've got a problem with our new electric platform that's been bleeding money for 6 months, and no one's been able to crack it. I need someone who can think differently, someone who can see solutions no one else can. And you think that's me? I know it is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What about hours? Travel? Flexible. I'll put it in your contract. You work the hours that make sense for your family. If you need to leave early to pick up your daughter, you leave early. If you need to work from home some days, you work from home. I don't care where or when you do the job, as long as it gets done. And if I can't do it? If I'm too rusty, or I've been out too long, or I'm just not as good as you think I am? Vivian smiled slightly. Then I'll fire you and we'll both move on. But I don't think that's going to happen. He studied her face, and she let him see that she meant it. When would I start? He asked. Monday, if you're ready. I don't have anything to wear. He gestured at his jeans. This is pretty much my wardrobe. Wear what you want. I don't care about clothes. Your board might. Let me worry about my board. He almost smiled. Almost. Okay. Okay? Yeah, I'll do it. Relief hit her so hard she almost laughed. Good. I'll have the contracts drawn up. You can review them, make any changes you need, and we'll go from there. And if I hate it, if it's too much, then you walk away. No hard feelings. He nodded slowly, then he held out his hand. Thanks for not giving up on me. She shook his hand, felt the rough calluses against her palm. Thanks for giving yourself another chance. He left, and Vivian stood in her office, staring at the door he'd walked through, feeling like something fundamental had just shifted in her carefully ordered world. She didn't know what was coming. Didn't know if this would work or fall apart spectacularly, but for the first time in years, she was willing to find out. Ethan's first day at Ashford Dynamics started with him sitting in his truck in the parking garage for 20 minutes, trying to convince himself to go inside. The building was all glass and steel, reaching up into the sky like it was trying to prove something. Through the windows, he could see people moving around in their suits and their polished shoes, and he felt like an imposter before he'd even stepped out of the vehicle. He'd worn the nicest thing he owned, a button-down shirt Sophie had picked out for him at a department store 3 days ago, pressed slacks he'd had to dig out of the back of his closet, shoes that pinched his feet because he hadn't worn dress shoes in 6 years. He looked almost professional. Almost. Finally, he grabbed the bag with his laptop and the contract he'd signed and got out of the truck. The elevator ride up to the 15th floor felt like it took an hour. When the doors opened, he stepped into a reception area that looked like something out of a magazine. Sleek furniture, abstract art on the walls, a receptionist who smiled at him like she'd been trained to smile at everyone exactly the same way. Ethan Cole, he said. I'm supposed to start today. Of course. Ms. Ashford is expecting you. I'll let her know you're here. He waited, standing because sitting felt wrong, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go badly. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind running through worst-case scenarios on a loop. What if he'd forgotten everything? What if 6 years away had erased all the knowledge he'd spent a decade building? What if Vivian realized she'd made a mistake and sent him home before lunch? Sophie had hugged him that morning before school, told him he was going to be great, and he'd wanted to believe her. But standing here now, he wasn't so sure. Ethan? He turned. Vivian was walking toward him, dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than his truck, her hair pulled back, heels clicking on the polished floor. She looked every inch the CEO, and he felt the gap between them widen to something almost unbridgeable. You made it, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like relief. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure where to park. Don't apologize. Come on, I'll show you around. She led him through the office, pointing out conference rooms and break areas, and the engineering wing where he'd be working. People glanced at him as they passed, curious, maybe sizing him up. He tried to ignore it. Your office is here, Vivian said, stopping in front of a door with his name already on it. I had it set up your computer this morning. If you need anything else, just let me know. Ethan stepped inside. The office was bigger than his living room at home. Windows overlooking the city, a desk that looked like it had never been used, bookshelves waiting to be filled. It felt surreal. This is too much, he said. It's standard for department heads. I'm not a department head. You are now. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. How are you feeling? Honestly, terrified. Good. That means you care. She checked her watch. The engineering team meets in 15 minutes. I'll introduce you, and then I need you to sit in on a review of the electric platform problem I mentioned. Just observe today. Get a sense of where things stand. Okay. And Ethan? She waited until he looked at her. You belong here. I wouldn't have hired you if I didn't believe that. He wanted to argue, but she was already gone. The engineering team turned out to be 12 people crammed into a conference room that felt too small for the egos it contained. Vivian introduced him with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done this 100 times before, and the team responded with polite nods and handshakes that ranged from genuinely welcoming to openly skeptical. The man sitting closest to the head of the table, Marcus, the interim lead, looked at Ethan like he was trying to figure out whether to see him as a threat or a joke. So you're the genius Vivian found on the side of the road, Marcus said, and there was just enough edge in his voice to make it not quite a compliment. I fixed her car, Ethan said evenly. I don't know about genius. Well, you're in the hot seat now. We've been stuck on the same problem for months, and if Vivian thinks you're the one who's going to crack it, you've got a lot to prove. Vivian cut in before Ethan could respond. Marcus, why don't you walk us through where things stand? The next hour was brutal. Marcus pulled up slides, diagrams, data logs, walking them through the electric platform issue like he was conducting a seminar. The problem, as far as Ethan could tell, was that the new battery management system was bleeding energy at a rate that made the vehicles commercially unviable. They'd tried 6 different solutions, none of which had worked. The engineers had theories, faulty sensors, coding errors, thermal regulation issues, but no one could pin down the root cause. Ethan listened, taking notes, trying to absorb everything at once. It had been so long since he'd been in a room like this, surrounded by people who spoke in technical shorthand and threw around jargon like it was a second language. He'd forgotten how much he missed it, and how much it intimidated him. Any thoughts? Marcus asked when he finished, looking directly at Ethan. Not yet, Ethan said. I need to look at the data myself before I can say anything useful. Fair enough. Marcus didn't look convinced. We'll send you everything we've got. Good luck making sense of it. The meeting ended and people filtered out, most of them ignoring Ethan entirely. Vivian stayed behind, closing the door after the last person left. That was a test, she said. I figured. Marcus doesn't think you can do this. He thinks I hired you on a whim. Did you? She smiled slightly. No, but he's going to push you. They all are. You need to be ready for that. I don't know if I am. Then fake it until you are. She sat down across from him. I'm not expecting miracles on day 1, Ethan. I'm expecting you to show up, do the work, and trust yourself. Can you do that? He thought about Sophie, about the way she'd looked at him that morning with so much faith it had almost hurt. Yeah, I can do that. Good. Vivian stood. Take the rest of the day to get settled. Review the data. Tomorrow, we'll dig in. She left, and Ethan sat alone in the conference room, staring at the whiteboard covered in equations and diagrams that didn't quite add up. He felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders, the expectations, the skepticism, the gap between who he used to be and who he was now. But underneath all of that, there was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement. That night, Ethan picked up Sophie from his neighbor's house, Mrs. Chen, who watched her after school most days, and drove home with his daughter chattering about her day, about the art project she'd finished and the spelling test she'd aced, and the boy in her class who'd brought a lizard for show and tell. How was your first day? Sophie asked when she finally paused for breath. Overwhelming. In a good way or a bad way? Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was 6, but sometimes she sounded 40. I'm not sure yet. Did people like you? I don't think they know what to make of me. That's okay, Sophie said. You don't have to make everyone like you on the first day. You just have to not mess up too bad. He laughed despite himself. Where'd you learn that? Mrs. Chen. She said that's how she survived her first week at the grocery store. Mrs. Chen is a wise woman. They got home, a small house on a quiet street. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. And Ethan made dinner while Sophie did her homework at the kitchen table. Spaghetti with jarred sauce, garlic bread from the freezer, the kind of meal that required minimal effort and maximum efficiency. Dad? Sophie said, looking up from her math worksheet. Yeah? Are you happy you took the job? Ethan paused, the question hitting him harder than it should have. I don't know yet, Bug. Ask me again in a few weeks. Okay. She went back to her worksheet, and Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her, feeling the familiar ache of wanting to give her more than he had. A better house, a better life. A version of himself that wasn't still trying to figure out how to function after losing the person who'd made everything make sense. But maybe this job was a start. After Sophie went to bed, Ethan opened his laptop and started digging into the data Marcus had sent over. Spreadsheets, diagnostic logs, testing reports, thousands of data points that didn't quite tell a coherent story. He worked until 2 a.m, chasing threads that led nowhere, building mental models that collapsed under scrutiny. By the time he finally closed the laptop, his eyes were burning and his head hurt, but something was starting to take shape. Not a solution yet, just the faintest outline of a pattern he couldn't quite see. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Ethan would drop Sophie at school, drive to Ashford Dynamics, and spend the day buried in technical work that stretched his brain in ways he'd forgotten were possible. The engineering team treated him with a mix of curiosity and wariness, waiting to see if he'd prove himself or crash and burn. Marcus, in particular, seemed determined to make things difficult. He'd ask Ethan pointed questions in meetings, challenge his suggestions before he'd even finish making them, and subtly undermine him in front of the team. It wasn't quite hostile, but it was close. "He's testing you," Vivian said one afternoon when Ethan mentioned it. They were in her office, reviewing a proposal he'd drafted for a new testing protocol. "I know. Are you going to let him get to you?" "I'm trying not to. Try harder." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Marcus has been with this company for 8 years. He thought he was going to get your job. When I hired you instead, it hurt his pride. He's not going to make this easy. So what do? You do the work. You prove you're better than he is, and when he realizes he can't intimidate you, he'll either fall in line or leave." Ethan wasn't sure it was that simple, but he didn't argue. The breakthrough came 3 weeks in, late on a Thursday night. Ethan was alone in his office, staring at the same diagnostic logs he'd been staring at for days, when something clicked. A discrepancy in the thermal regulation data that everyone had dismissed as a sensor error. But what if it wasn't an error? What if it was the sensor accurately reporting a problem no one had thought to look for? He pulled up the design schematics, cross-referenced them with the testing data, and started building a model. 2 hours later, he had it. The battery management system wasn't the problem. The problem was in the cooling system integration, a design flaw so subtle it had been invisible until you knew where to look. He felt his pulse kick up, adrenaline flooding through him. This was it. This was the answer. He called Vivian. It was almost midnight, but she picked up on the second ring. "This better be good," she said. "I found it. The problem with the electric platform. I know what's causing the energy bleed." There was a pause. Then, "I'm coming in." She was there in 20 minutes, still dressed like she'd been out somewhere, heels swapped for flats, but otherwise looking as put together as ever. Ethan walked her through his findings, pulling up diagrams and data points, showing her the flaw in the cooling system integration that had been sabotaging the entire platform. Vivian listened, asking sharp questions, poking at his logic until she was satisfied it held up. When he finished, she sat back and stared at the screen. "How long would it take to fix this?" she asked. "If we redesign the integration? 4 weeks, maybe 6. But we'd need to pull the current units from testing and start over." "That's going to cost money." "Less than it'll cost if we go to market with a product that doesn't work." She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "You're sure about this?" "As sure as I can be without building a prototype." "Then we build a prototype." She stood. "I'll call a meeting for tomorrow morning. You're going to present this to the team." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Vivian, this is your solution. You present it." "Marcus is going to tear me apart. Let him try." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made him think she was looking forward to it. "You've got the data. You've got the answer. Now prove you deserve to be here." The meeting the next morning was exactly as brutal as Ethan had expected. He stood at the front of the conference room, pulling up his findings on the screen, while Marcus and the rest of the engineering team watched with varying degrees of skepticism. He walked them through the data, the flaw in the cooling system, the proposed redesign. He kept his voice steady, his explanations clear, even as Marcus interrupted him 3 times to question his methodology. "This is based on one discrepancy in the thermal data," Marcus said. "You're asking us to scrap months of work because of one anomaly?" "It's not an anomaly," Ethan said. "It's a pattern. Look at the data from the last 6 testing cycles. The energy bleed correlates directly with cooling system activation, every single time. Correlation isn't causation. You're right, which is why I'm proposing we build a prototype with the redesigned integration and test it. If I'm wrong, we'll know in 2 weeks. If I'm right, we save the entire platform." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Vivian cut him off. "We're building the prototype," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "Ethan's analysis is sound, and we've wasted enough time chasing solutions that don't work. If anyone has a better idea, now's the time to speak up." No one did. "Good," Vivian said. Marcus, I need you to coordinate with manufacturing. Ethan, you're leading the redesign. I want daily updates on progress. The meeting ended and people filed out, most of them looking shell-shocked. Marcus lingered, his jaw tight, but he didn't say anything. Just gave Ethan a look that promised this wasn't over and left. Ethan stood there feeling like he'd just survived something. Vivian walked over, handed him a coffee she'd grabbed from the sideboard. You did good. Marcus hates me. Marcus hates everyone. Don't take it personally. Hard not to. She looked at him and her expression softened slightly. You just solved a problem that's been bleeding this company money for 6 months. You think I care if Marcus likes you? I guess not. Damn right. She took a sip of her own coffee. Now get to work. You've got a prototype to build. The next 2 weeks were a blur. Ethan worked longer hours than he had in years, coordinating with the manufacturing team, refining the design, running simulations to test every possible failure point. Sophie started spending more time at Mrs. Chen's house, and the guilt of that sat heavy in Ethan's chest. But every time he thought about pulling back, he remembered the look on Vivian's face when he'd shown her the solution, the way she'd trusted him to see it through. He couldn't let her down. The prototype came together faster than anyone expected. By the end of the second week, they had a working unit ready for testing. Ethan stood in the lab with Marcus and 2 other engineers watching as they ran the first diagnostic cycle. The energy bleed was gone. Marcus stared at the readout, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Ethan and said, "Run it again." They ran it 3 more times. Same result. The redesigned cooling system integration had solved the problem. Well, Marcus said finally, I guess you were right. It wasn't exactly an apology, but Ethan would take it. Vivian called him into her office that afternoon. When he walked in, she was standing by the window, looking out at the city, and she didn't turn around right away. The board got the test results, she said. And they're happy, very happy. She turned to face him. You just saved this company millions of dollars, Ethan. You know that, right? He didn't know what to say to that. I'm putting you in charge of the full platform rollout, she continued. You'll work with Marcus and the team to implement the redesign across all units. It's going to be a lot of work, but I think you can handle it. Vivian, don't argue. You earned this. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in her face he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just his boss. She was someone who'd taken a massive risk on him, who'd believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself, and who was now watching him succeed with something that looked almost like pride. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. That night, Ethan got home earlier than he had in weeks. He picked up Sophie from Mrs. Chen's, made her favorite dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs cut up in it, and sat with her while she told him about the science project she was working on. You seem happy, Sophie said, watching him over her plate. I am. Because of work? Yeah, I think I'm actually good at this. She grinned. I told you. You did. So does this mean we're staying? You're not going to quit? Ethan hesitated. The question was bigger than she realized. Staying meant committing to this, meant trusting that he could balance being a father and being an engineer, that he wouldn't lose himself the way he had before. But looking at Sophie now, seeing the hope in her eyes, he realized he didn't want to quit. For the first time since Emily died, he wanted to build something again. Not just for himself, for both of them. Yeah, Bug, he said, we're staying. Sophie cheered, and Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The weeks that followed were different. Ethan still worked hard, still put in long hours, but he'd figured out how to set boundaries. He left by 5 most days to pick up Sophie. He worked from home when she had school events, and when the pressure got too intense, he'd think about what Vivian had told him that first day, that he didn't have to sacrifice his daughter to do this job well. Marcus, surprisingly, became less of a problem. After the prototype success, something shifted between them. Not quite friendship, but a grudging respect. Marcus still challenged him in meetings, still pushed back on his ideas, but it felt less like sabotage and more like the kind of friction that made the work better. And Vivian was a constant. She checked in on him regularly, asked how Sophie was doing, made sure he wasn't burning out. They started having lunch together once a week, ostensibly to discuss project updates, but the conversations always drifted beyond work. She told him about the pressure from the board, the expectations that came with being the only woman CEO in a male-dominated industry. He told her about the loneliness of single parenthood, the fear that he was screwing up his daughter by not being enough. "You're not screwing her up," Vivian said one afternoon. They were in her office, takeout containers spread across her desk. "She's lucky to have you. She deserves more. She deserves a father who shows up for her, and from what I can tell, that's exactly what she has." Ethan wanted to believe that. Some days, he almost did. 2 months after he'd started, the redesigned electric platform went into full production. The first units rolled off the assembly line with zero energy bleed, and the early reviews from dealers were glowing. Vivian called an all-hands meeting to announce the success, and when she mentioned Ethan by name, crediting him with solving the problem, the applause that followed felt surreal. He stood there, surrounded by people who 3 months ago had looked at him like he didn't belong, and realized something had changed. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was part of this. After the meeting, Vivian caught up with him in the hallway. "Congratulations," she said. "I didn't do it alone." "No, but you did the part no one else could." She paused. "How does it feel?" Ethan thought about it. About the fear he'd carried into this building on his first day. The doubt that had whispered he wasn't good enough. The belief that he'd lost his edge and would never get it back. "It feels like I'm not broken anymore," he said. Vivian's expression softened, and for a moment she looked less like a CEO and more like a person. "You were never broken, Ethan. You were just healing." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the hallway with the strangest sense that something between them had shifted. Something he didn't quite have a name for yet. But he felt it, and judging by the way she'd looked at him, she felt it too. The interview request came on a Thursday morning, 3 months into Ethan's tenure at Ashford Dynamics. Vivian's assistant called him into her office, and when he walked in, she was standing by her desk with an expression he couldn't quite read. "There's a trade publication that wants to do a feature on the electric platform redesign," she said without preamble. "They want to interview you." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Me? You're the lead engineer. You solved the problem. It makes sense. Can't Marcus do it? He's been here longer. He knows how to talk to press." "They specifically asked for you." She handed him a printed email. "Automotive Innovation Weekly. It's one of the biggest publications in the industry. This kind of exposure is good for the company. Good for you." He scanned the email, saw his name mentioned twice, and felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this." "You are." Vivian's voice was firm. "I need you to trust me on that." "What if I screw it up?" "Then we'll deal with it. But you won't." He wanted to argue, but the look on her face stopped him. She wasn't asking. She was telling him this was happening, and he needed to figure out how to handle it. "When is it?" he asked. "Next Tuesday. They'll come here, tour the facility, interview you and a few other team members. I'll sit in if you want." "Yeah, that would help." She nodded, and something in her expression softened. "You've come a long way, Ethan. I know this feels uncomfortable, but you deserve the recognition." He left her office feeling like he'd just been handed something fragile and breakable, and he had no idea how to hold it without dropping it. The weekend was a mess of preparation. Ethan rehearsed answers to questions he thought they might ask, practiced talking about the redesign without sounding like he was either bragging or downplaying his role. Sophie watched him pace around the living room on Saturday night, notes scattered across the coffee table, and finally said, "Dad, you're making me nervous." "Sorry, Bug." "Why are you so worried? You fixed the thing. Just tell them how you did it." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He sat down next to her, tried to find words that made sense. "Because people are going to read this and have opinions about me, about whether I'm good enough to be doing this job. And I'm still not sure I am." Sophie frowned. "But Mrs. Ashford thinks you are. And she's really smart, right?" "Yeah, she is." "So maybe you should believe her." Ethan looked at his daughter, at the way she said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and felt something shift in his chest. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just don't listen." He laughed, pulled her into a hug, and decided to stop rehearsing. Tuesday arrived too fast. The journalists showed up at 10, 2 of them, a woman named Rebecca who seemed to be in charge and a younger guy named Tom who carried the camera equipment. Vivian met them in the lobby, all polished professionalism, and led them up to the engineering wing where Ethan was waiting. "This is Ethan Cole," Vivian said, making introductions. "Lead engineer on the electric platform project." Rebecca shook his hand, smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thanks for agreeing to this. We've been following the platform development for months. The turnaround you managed is pretty impressive. It was a team effort, Ethan said automatically. Sure, but you're the one who identified the root cause, right? The cooling system flaw? Yes. How long did it take you to figure it out? And just like that, they were into it. Rebecca fired questions at him while Tom set up the camera, and Ethan answered as best he could, trying to sound confident without overselling himself. Vivian stood off to the side, watching, and every time he glanced at her, she gave him a small nod that said he was doing fine. They toured the facility, filmed some of the production line, interviewed Marcus and two other engineers. Marcus was smooth, articulate, giving sound bites that would probably make great quotes. Ethan felt clumsy by comparison, stumbling over technical explanations, second-guessing his answers. When they finally wrapped up around 2, Rebecca thanked them and said the piece would run in next month's issue. Vivian walked them out, and Ethan stood in the engineering lab feeling like he'd just survived something exhausting. Marcus came up beside him. "You did okay." "I felt like an idiot." "You always feel like an idiot. Doesn't mean you are." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "They got what they needed. Try not to overthink it." It was the closest thing to encouragement Marcus had ever given him, and Ethan didn't know what to do with it except nod and try to believe him. That night, he told Sophie about the interview over dinner. She wanted to know if they'd taken his picture, if he'd said anything embarrassing, if he was going to be famous now. "I'm not going to be famous," he said, "but you might be a little bit famous." "Maybe a little bit," she grinned. "Can I tell my class?" "Let's wait until the article actually comes out." "Fine. But when it does, I'm bringing it for show and tell." Ethan laughed despite himself, and the tension he'd been carrying all day started to ease. The article published 4 weeks later. Vivian's assistant brought a copy to Ethan's office first thing in the morning, and he stared at the cover. A photo of one of their electric vehicles with the headline, "Innovation Under Pressure, How Ashford Dynamics Solved the Unsolvable." Inside, there was a 2-page spread with photos from the facility tour, quotes from the team, and a section focused entirely on him. They'd used a photo of him standing in front of a whiteboard covered in equations, looking more serious than he remembered feeling. The article called him a quiet genius and credited him with single-handedly saving the platform. He read it twice, feeling a complicated mix of pride and discomfort. They'd made him sound like some kind of hero, and he didn't know how to reconcile that with the guy who still sometimes felt like he was faking his way through every meeting. Vivian showed up at his office around 10. "You saw it?" "Yeah." "And?" "It's weird seeing myself described like that." She leaned against his desk, picked up the magazine, skimmed the section about him. "They're not wrong. They made it sound like I did everything myself. You did the part that mattered most. The rest of us were just implementing your solution." She set the magazine down. "You need to get comfortable with this, Ethan. People are going to recognize what you've done here. That's not a bad thing." "Feels like a lot of pressure." "It is, but you can handle it." He wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe he was the person they'd written about in that article. But the gap between who he'd been 6 months ago and who they were saying he was now felt impossible to bridge. "The board wants to meet you," Vivian said. Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" "They saw the article. They want to have dinner with you next week. Get to know the man behind the success story." "Vivian, I can't." "Yes, you can, and you will." Her voice was gentle but firm. "This is part of the job. You're not just an engineer anymore. You're a senior leader at this company, and that comes with responsibilities beyond the technical work." "I didn't sign up for that." "Actually, you did. It was in your contract." She smiled slightly. "You just didn't read the fine print." He stared at her, feeling trapped. "I don't know how to do this." "Then I'll teach you." She straightened up. "Dinner is next Thursday at 7. Wear a suit. I'll be there, so you won't be alone. And Ethan, you've already impressed them with your work. Now you just need to show them you can handle everything else that comes with it." She left before he could argue, and Ethan sat there with the magazine in his hands, wondering how he'd ended up here. 3 months ago, he'd been fixing cars on the side of the highway. Now he was having dinner with board members and being called a genius in industry publications. It felt surreal and terrifying, and maybe just a little bit exciting. The week leading up to the dinner was chaos. Ethan tried to prepare, reading up on the board members, memorizing their backgrounds, figuring out what they might want to know about him. Sophie helped him pick out a suit, or rather, she helped him realize he needed to buy a suit because the one he owned was 15 years old and didn't fit anymore. They went shopping together on Saturday, Sophie treating it like an adventure, pulling suits off racks and making him try them on while she sat in the dressing room area and gave her opinions. "Too boring," she said when he came out in a plain black suit. "It's a suit. It's supposed to be boring." "Not that boring. Try the blue one." He tried the blue one. It fit better, looked more modern, and Sophie nodded her approval. "That's the one? You sure?" "Dad, I'm 6, but even I know you look good in that one." He bought the suit, along with a shirt and tie that Sophie insisted matched better than the ones he'd picked. On the drive home, she said, "Are you nervous about the dinner?" "Terrified." "Why?" "Because these are important people who decide whether I keep my job or not." "But you're good at your job. Ms. Ashford said so." "Yeah, but this isn't about engineering. This is about being the kind of person they want representing the company. And I don't know if I'm that person." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom used to say you worried too much about what other people thought. She said you were already good enough. You just couldn't see it." Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that. "She said that?" "Yeah, when I was really little, before she got sick. I didn't really understand it then, but I think I do now." He pulled into their driveway, turned off the engine, and looked at his daughter. "You know I love you, right?" "Duh." "I mean it. You're the best thing I ever did." Sophie rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're getting weird, Dad." "I'm allowed to get weird." She hugged him before getting out of the car, and Ethan sat there for a moment, holding on to the feeling. Thursday came. Ethan dropped Sophie at Mrs. Chen's house with instructions that he'd pick her up by 9, then drove to the restaurant where the dinner was being held. It was the kind of place where the menu didn't list prices and the waitstaff moved like they'd been trained in hospitality at a molecular level. Vivian was already there when he arrived, standing near the entrance in a dark dress that made her look even more intimidating than usual. But when she saw him, her expression softened. "You look good," she said. Sophie picked the suit. "She has good taste." Vivian glanced toward the private dining room in the back. "They're already here. 5 board members, plus the CFO. I'll introduce you, and then just follow my lead." "What if I say something stupid?" "You won't." "How do you know?" She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite name. "Because you're smarter than you think you are, and because I'm not going to let you fail." They walked into the dining room together, and Ethan felt like he was stepping into a different world. The board members were all older, polished, the kind of people who radiated power and money. Vivian made introductions, names he'd memorized, faces he'd studied online, and he shook hands, smiled, tried to project confidence he didn't feel. They sat down, ordered drinks, and the conversation started. At first it was general, talk about the industry, the market, the competition. Ethan listened more than he spoke, trying to get a read on the dynamics. Then one of the board members, a man named Gerald, who'd made his fortune in manufacturing, turned to him. "So, Ethan, Vivian tells us you came from a pretty unconventional background, fixing cars on the side of the road, wasn't it?" There was something in his tone that felt like a test. Ethan glanced at Vivian, who gave him the smallest nod. "That's right," Ethan said. "I took some time away from engineering after my wife died. Did repair work to make ends meet. And now you're here. That's quite a jump." "It is." "What made you decide to come back?" Ethan thought about the question, about the real answer, that he'd been scared and lonely and slowly disappearing into a life that felt too small. That Vivian had seen something in him he'd stopped seeing in himself. But he couldn't say that. Not here. "I realized I missed the work," he said instead. "Missed building things, solving problems, and Vivian gave me a chance to do that again." Gerald nodded slowly. "She has a habit of taking risks on people. Doesn't always work out." "Gerald," Vivian said, her voice sharp. "I'm just saying, we've seen her bring in people before who didn't pan out. I want to make sure this isn't another one of those situations." Ethan felt the insult land, saw the way Vivian's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, he spoke. "I can't speak to other people she's hired," Ethan said, "but I can tell you that the electric platform redesign is working. We're ahead of schedule, under budget, and the early feedback from dealers is better than anyone projected. If that's not panning out, I don't know what is." The table went quiet. Gerald looked at him, something shifting in his expression. Then he smiled. "Fair enough. I like someone who doesn't back down." The tension eased and the conversation moved on. They asked him about his engineering background, his plans for future projects, his thoughts on where the industry was headed. Ethan answered as honestly as he could, feeling less like he was being interrogated and more like he was being evaluated. It wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. By the time dessert arrived, he'd started to relax. These people weren't monsters. They were just people trying to protect their investment. And if he could prove he was worth that investment, they'd leave him alone. After dinner, Vivian walked him out to the parking garage. "You did really well in there," she said. "Gerald was testing me." "He tests everyone. You handled it." "I wasn't sure I would." She stopped, turned to face him. "Ethan, you need to stop doubting yourself. You've proven you belong here. The only person who doesn't believe that is you." He looked at her, at the way the fluorescent lights caught in her hair, at the way she was looking at him like she could see through all the walls he'd built. "Why do you care so much?" "What? Why does it matter to you if I believe in myself or not? You got what you needed. I fixed the problem. The board's happy. You could just let me do my job and leave me alone." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Because you remind me of something I forgot." "What's that?" "That there's more to life than winning. That sometimes the best thing you can do is help someone who's lost find their way back." She paused. "You were drowning when I met you, Ethan, and I pulled you out because I saw something worth saving. I still see it. I just wish you could see it too." The words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know what to say, so he just stood there, looking at her, feeling the weight of everything she'd just said settle into his bones. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything. Don't thank me yet. We've still got a lot of work to do." She walked to her car, and Ethan stood there watching her go, feeling like something fundamental had just shifted between them. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and board updates and more press inquiries than Ethan knew how to handle. The electric platform went into full production, and the initial sales numbers were stronger than anyone had projected. Vivian gave him more responsibility, more projects, more visibility within the company. And with every success, the distance between who he'd been and who he was becoming grew wider. But it wasn't just work that was changing, it was everything. Sophie started asking questions about Vivian. Why did he talk about her so much? Why did she call him at night sometimes to discuss project updates? Did he like her? "She's my boss," Ethan said, deflecting. "That's not what I asked." She's a good person, and a good boss." "Do you think she's pretty?" Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "Sophie, it's not like that." "Okay." Sophie didn't look convinced. "But if it was like that, would you tell me?" "There's nothing to tell." "Uh-huh." She dropped it, but Ethan couldn't, because the truth was he had started thinking about Vivian differently. Not just as his boss, but as someone he looked forward to seeing. Someone whose opinion mattered in ways that went beyond professional respect. Someone who made him feel like he was more than just a guy trying to survive. And that terrified him. Because getting close to someone meant risking loss again. Meant opening himself up to the possibility that everything could fall apart the way it had before. And he didn't know if he was strong enough to survive that a second time. One night, working late on a project deadline, Vivian came by his office around 8. She knocked on the open door, and he looked up to see her standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said. "Thanks." He took the cup, gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What are you still doing here?" "Same thing you are. Too much work, not enough hours." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee, the office quiet around them. Then Vivian said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Do you ever think about dating again?" The question caught him off guard. "Where'd that come from?" "I don't know. Just curious." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "It's been 6 years since your wife died. That's a long time to be alone." "I'm not alone. I have Sophie." "You know what I mean." He did, and he didn't want to talk about it. But Vivian was looking at him with that expression she got sometimes, the one that said she wasn't going to let this go. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. but it feels wrong. Like I'd be betraying Emily. Would she want you to be alone forever? No, she'd probably tell me to move on, find someone who makes me happy. But knowing that doesn't make it easier. Vivian nodded slowly. I get it. After my divorce, I swore off relationships entirely, decided I was better off alone, that no one was worth the risk. And for a long time, I believed that. What changed? She smiled slightly. I met someone who made me remember what it felt like to connect with another person. Someone who didn't want anything from me except to be myself. Ethan's heart kicked up, and he wasn't sure if she was talking about him or someone else. Did it work out? I don't know yet. She stood, set her empty cup on his desk. But I'm starting to think maybe it's worth finding out. She left before he could respond, and Ethan sat there, staring at the spot where she'd been standing, wondering if he'd just imagined the entire conversation or if it had meant what he thought it meant. Sophie noticed the change in him. She didn't say anything directly, but she started leaving little drawings on his desk, stick figures of him and a woman who looked suspiciously like Vivian, always smiling, always holding hands. When he asked her about them, she just shrugged and said she thought he seemed happier lately. I am happy, he said. Good. You should stay that way. And for the first time in years, Ethan thought maybe he could. The invitation arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered to Ethan's desk by Vivian's assistant, with a note that simply said, "No pressure, but I'd really like you to come." It was for a company gala scheduled 3 weeks out. One of those formal events where executives wore tuxedos and made speeches about quarterly earnings while pretending to care about the charity they were raising money for. Ethan had managed to avoid the last two, citing childcare conflicts, but this time the note made it clear Vivian expected him there. He called her office. She picked up on the first ring. "You got the invitation," she said. "Yeah, do I have to go?" "Technically, no, but the board specifically asked if you'd be there. After the article and the platform's success, they want to show you off." "I'm not a trophy." "I know. But you're also not just an engineer anymore. You're part of the leadership team now, whether you like it or not." She paused. "Besides, I could use someone there who won't bore me to death with small talk about stock options." Ethan almost smiled. "Is that what this is? You need a buffer?" "Maybe. Is it working? I'll think about it." "Think fast. I need to finalize the seating chart." He hung up and stared at the invitation, feeling the familiar anxiety creep in. These events weren't his world. But then again, 6 months ago, none of this had been his world, and he'd managed to survive it so far. That night he asked Sophie what she thought. "Do you want to go?" she asked, looking up from her homework. "Not really, but Vivian wants me there." "Then you should go." "It's not that simple." Sophie set down her pencil. "Dad, you like her, and she likes you. I'm 6, and even I can see it. So stop making it complicated and just go to the stupid party." Ethan stared at his daughter. "When did you get so smart?" "I told you, I've always been smart. You just don't listen." He went to the gala. The venue was a hotel ballroom downtown, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Ethan arrived feeling absurdly out of place in his rented tuxedo, handed his keys to a valet who looked younger than some of his interns, and walked inside trying to remember how to breathe normally. The room was packed with people he half recognized from board meetings and company events, everyone dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread. He spotted Marcus near the bar, chatting with someone from marketing, and considered joining him before deciding he'd rather face this alone. Then he saw Vivian. She was standing near the far end of the room, wearing a floor-length dress that was somehow both elegant and understated, her hair down for once instead of pulled back in her usual severe style. She was talking to one of the board members, smiling at something he'd said, and Ethan felt something shift in his chest. She looked up, caught his eye across the room, and her smile changed, became something softer, more genuine. She excused herself and walked over to him. "You came," she said. "You made it sound important." "It is, to me." She glanced around the room. "These things are unbearable, but they're slightly less unbearable when there's someone here I actually want to talk to. Happy to be of service." She laughed, and the sound did something to him he wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people before dinner starts." She guided him through the room, making introductions, handling the social dynamics with the kind of ease that came from years of practice. Ethan followed her lead, shaking hands, making polite conversation, trying not to feel like he was drowning. At one point, she rested her hand on his arm while talking to a potential investor, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made his pulse spike. When they finally sat down for dinner, Ethan found himself at a table with Vivian, two board members, and their spouses. The conversation was exactly as tedious as he'd expected. Stock prices, market projections, complaints about regulations. He mostly stayed quiet, letting the others talk, until one of the board members' wives turned to him. "So, Ethan, Vivian tells us you're a single father. That must be challenging, balancing work and family." "It has its moments," he said carefully. "How old is your daughter?" 6. "What a lovely age. And her mother?" The question landed like a punch. Ethan felt his throat tighten, saw Vivian stiffen beside him. "She passed away 6 years ago," he said, keeping his voice even. The woman's face went pale. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to—" "It's fine. You didn't know." An awkward silence settled over the table. Then Vivian smoothly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward something safer, and Ethan silently thanked her for the rescue. After dinner, there were speeches, the CEO, a few board members, someone from the charity they were supporting. Ethan tried to pay attention, but his mind kept drifting, to the way Vivian had defended him at that table, to the way she'd looked at him when he first arrived, to the growing realization that this thing between them, whatever it was, had moved beyond professional respect into something he didn't know how to name. When the speeches finally ended and people started moving to the bar or the dance floor, Vivian leaned over and said, "Want to get some air?" "Please." They slipped out through a side door onto a balcony that overlooked the city. The night air was cool, a relief after the stuffy warmth of the ballroom. Ethan loosened his bow tie, and Vivian leaned against the railing, looking out at the lights. "Sorry about that woman," she said. "She's always putting her foot in her mouth." "It's okay. People ask. I'm used to it." "Doesn't make it easier." "No." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Vivian said, "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me if I'm overstepping." "Go ahead." "Do you ever talk to Sophie about her mother? About what happened?" Ethan thought about it. "Sometimes. Not as much as I probably should. I don't want to make her sad. She might need to be sad sometimes. To remember her mother as a real person, not just this perfect memory." Emily wasn't perfect. "I know, but kids have a way of turning people into saints when they're gone. It might help Sophie to know her mother had flaws, made mistakes, was human." Ethan looked at Vivian, surprised by the insight. "You sound like you've thought about this." "My father died when I was 12. For years, my mother treated him like he'd been this flawless husband, this perfect man. And I grew up thinking I could never measure up to his memory. It wasn't until I was older that I learned the truth, that he'd been difficult, sometimes cruel, that their marriage had been falling apart before he died." She paused. "I'm not saying you should tell Sophie things that would hurt her, but maybe let her see that her mother was real, that it's okay to remember the complicated parts too." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. "Emily used to get frustrated with me. I'd get so focused on work I'd forget to eat, forget we had plans. She'd leave these passive-aggressive notes around the house reminding me to be present. It drove me crazy at the time. And now? Now I'd give anything to find one of those notes again." He looked out at the city. "After she died, I couldn't handle going back to that life. The work that had consumed me felt meaningless, so I walked away and convinced myself I was doing it for Sophie. But really, I was doing it because I couldn't face the guilt." "Guilt about what?" "About all the time I wasted, all the moments I missed because I was too busy solving problems that didn't matter." He turned to face her. "That's why I was so scared to take this job. I didn't want to make the same mistakes again." "Have you?" "No. Because you won't let me." He smiled slightly. "You keep reminding me that Sophie comes first, that the work matters, but not more than she does. That's because it's true. I know. And I'm grateful for it." He hesitated, then said, "You've changed my life, Vivian. Not just the job. Everything." She looked at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression he'd never seen before. "You've changed mine too." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Ethan wanted to say more, wanted to close the distance between them, but before he could, the door to the balcony opened and someone called out that they were starting the auction inside. Vivian stepped back, the moment broken. We should go back in. Yeah. They returned to the ballroom, but something had shifted. For the rest of the night, Ethan was acutely aware of where Vivian was, who she was talking to, the way she'd glance at him across the room. And when the event finally ended and people started saying their goodbyes, she found him near the exit. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said. "Thanks for inviting me. Drive safe." "You too." He left feeling like they'd had an entirely different conversation underneath the words they'd actually said. The following week, Ethan threw himself into a new project, a redesign of the company's hybrid drivetrain system that had been underperforming for years. It was challenging work, the kind that required him to push the boundaries of what he thought he knew, and he welcomed the distraction. But Vivian kept finding reasons to stop by his office. Sometimes it was legitimate, questions about the project, updates on board feedback. Other times it felt like an excuse. She'd bring coffee, ask about Sophie, stay longer than necessary. And Ethan didn't stop her. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the gala, she came by around 4 and found him staring at a simulation that wasn't giving him the results he needed. "Problem?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee on his desk. "The thermal efficiency is dropping at higher speeds. I've tried 6 different configurations and nothing's working." She came around the desk to look at his screen. "What if you adjusted the coolant flow rate?" "Already tried that. Made it worse." She leaned closer, studying the data, and Ethan became acutely aware of how close she was. Close enough that he could smell her perfume, see the small scar near her temple that she usually covered with makeup. "Try inverting the valve sequence," she said. "That shouldn't work." "Try it anyway." He made the adjustment, ran the simulation, and watched as the efficiency numbers stabilized. Not perfect, but better than anything he'd managed all day. "How did you know that would work?" he asked. "I didn't, but sometimes the solution that shouldn't work is the one that does." She straightened up, smiled at him. "You're overthinking it. You do that when you're stressed." "I'm not stressed." "Ethan, your shoulders are up around your ears and you've been running your hand through your hair so much it's standing straight up." He reached up, felt his hair, and realized she was right. "Okay, maybe I'm a little stressed. What's going on?" He hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than deflection. "Sophie's school is doing parent-teacher conferences next week. Her teacher wants to talk about her progress, and I'm worried she's going to tell me I'm screwing something up." "Why would you think that?" "Because I'm barely holding it together most days. I'm working longer hours than I should, leaving her with Mrs. Chen more than I want, and I keep telling myself it's fine, but what if it's not? What if she needs more than I can give her?" Vivian sat down in the chair across from him. "Ethan, I've met Sophie. She's happy, well-adjusted, doing great in school. You're not screwing up." "How do you know?" "Because I see the way she looks at you, like you're her whole world. You can't fake that." She paused. "And for what it's worth, you're doing a better job than most parents who have 2 of them." "That's not a high bar." "It's higher than you think." She stood. "Come on, let's get out of here." "What?" "You've been staring at that screen for hours. You need a break. Let's go get dinner." "Vivian, I can't just leave." "Yes, you can. The project will still be here tomorrow, and you'll think more clearly after you eat something that isn't vending machine food." She had a point. Ethan saved his work, grabbed his jacket, and followed her out. They ended up at a small Italian place a few blocks from the office. The kind of restaurant that didn't take reservations and had checkered tablecloths that had seen better days. It was nothing like the places Vivian usually went, but she seemed perfectly comfortable ordering wine and bread and settling in like they had all the time in the world. "I didn't think you did places like this," Ethan said, looking around. "I don't usually, but I used to come here in college, before I became the person who only eats at places where you need a reservation 6 weeks in advance." She took a sip of wine. "Sometimes it's nice to remember who I was before all of this." "Who were you?" "Hungry, mostly, and scared. I put myself through business school working 3 jobs and living off ramen. This place was my one splurge. Once a month, I'd come here and order the cheapest pasta on the menu and convince myself I was going to make it." "Seems like you did." "Yeah, but I lost a lot along the way." She set down her glass. "I got so focused on proving I belonged, on being tougher and smarter and more ruthless than everyone else, that I forgot how to be a person. I stopped having friends. Stopped having relationships that weren't transactional. And by the time I realized what I'd done, it felt too late to change. It's not too late, isn't it? She looked at him. I'm 42 years old, Ethan. I've spent the last 20 years building walls, and I don't know how to take them down. Yes, you do. You're doing it right now. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Vivian said, Can I ask you something? Sure. That night on the balcony, at the gala, I felt like we were about to have a conversation that didn't happen. Was I imagining that? Ethan's heart kicked up. No, you weren't imagining it. What were you going to say? He set down his fork, trying to figure out how to answer that. I don't know, something I probably shouldn't say to my boss. What if I wasn't your boss? What would you say then? Vivian, I'm serious. Forget the job. Forget the company. Forget all of it. If we were just two people sitting here, what would you say? Ethan looked at her, at the vulnerability in her face, and felt something break open inside him. I'd say that I think about you more than I should. That when I'm not with you, I'm looking for excuses to be near you. That you've become the person I want to tell things to, the person whose opinion matters most, and that terrifies me because I don't know what to do with it. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. I'd say the same thing. This is a bad idea, Ethan said, even as his fingers closed around hers. Probably. We work together. You're my boss. This could get complicated. It's already complicated. Sophie, I know. And I would never ask you to choose between this and her. She comes first, always. Vivian squeezed his hand, but maybe there's room for both. Ethan wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe he could have this without sacrificing everything he'd built. But the fear was still there, whispering that he was making a mistake, that letting himself care about someone again would only end in loss. I need time, he said, to figure this out, to make sure it's what I want. Okay. Vivian pulled her hand back, and he immediately missed the contact. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. They finished dinner, the conversation shifting to safer topics, but the thing between them had been named now. It couldn't be ignored or pushed aside. And as Ethan drove home that night, he knew he was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to safety, to the comfortable distance he'd maintained with everyone since Emily died. The other led toward something unknown and terrifying and maybe, possibly, worth the risk. He didn't know which path to choose. The parent-teacher conference happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Ethan left work early, picked up Sophie from school, and sat in one of those tiny chairs designed for 6-year-olds while her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, pulled out folders and progress reports. Sophie is doing wonderfully, Ms. Rodriguez said. Her reading is above grade level, her math skills are strong, and she's very social with the other children. Ethan felt relief wash through him. That's great. There is one thing I wanted to mention, though. She's been drawing a lot of pictures lately, of families. Is that unusual? Not necessarily, but the families she draws always have a mother figure, and when I asked her about it, she said she was drawing what she wished her family looked like. Ethan's chest tightened. She never talks about her mother at home. She might not know how, or she might be protecting you. Miss Rodriguez leaned forward. Mr. Cole, I'm not trying to tell you how to parent, but from what I've observed, Sophie is a very empathetic child. She picks up on what the adults around her are feeling, and if you're still grieving, she's probably carrying that for you. The words hit harder than they should have. What do I do? Talk to her. Let her ask questions. Let her see that it's okay to be sad about her mother, and that you won't fall apart if she brings it up. That night, after dinner, Ethan sat down with Sophie in her room. She was coloring at her desk, humming something under her breath. Bug, can we talk? She looked up. Am I in trouble? No, I just want to ask you something. He sat on her bed. Ms. Rodriguez said you've been drawing pictures of families, with moms. Sophie's face fell. I wasn't lying. I know Mom's gone. I know you weren't lying. I just want to understand what you're thinking about. She set down her crayon, fidgeted with the edge of her paper. Sometimes I try to remember what she looked like, and I can't. And that makes me sad. Ethan felt his throat close up. I have pictures. We can look at them together if you want. I don't want to make you sad. Sophie, you could never make me sad by wanting to remember your mom. She loved you so much, and I should have been talking to you about her more. I'm sorry I haven't." "It's okay." "No, it's not." He pulled her into his lap. "Your mom was amazing, but she wasn't perfect. She used to get mad at me for leaving dishes in the sink, and she sang off key in the car, even though she thought she sounded great. And she made the worst pancakes you've ever tasted. They were always burnt on the outside and raw in the middle." Sophie giggled. "Really?" "Really. But she kept making them anyway because she loved breakfast food." He kissed the top of her head. "You can ask me about her any time. And if you want to be sad about missing her, that's okay too. I miss her every day. Do you think she'd be proud of us?" "Yeah, Bug. I think she'd be really proud." Sophie hugged him tight, and Ethan held her, feeling like maybe he was finally starting to get this right. That weekend, Vivian called him. Not about work, but to ask if he and Sophie wanted to come over for lunch. Ethan almost said no, almost retreated back into the safety of keeping his world separate. But then he thought about what Vivian had said at the restaurant, about there being room for both. "Sure," he said. "What should we bring?" Vivian lived in a penthouse that looked exactly like Ethan expected, sleek, modern, expensive. But when they arrived, she answered the door in jeans and a sweater, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "You must be Sophie," she said, crouching down to eye level. "Your dad talks about you all the time." Sophie looked her over critically. "Are you the lady he works for?" "I am." "He says you're really smart." "He's very kind, but I think he's smarter than I am." Sophie grinned. "I know." They had lunch on Vivian's balcony, sandwiches and fruit and cookies that Vivian admitted she'd bought from a bakery that morning because she didn't know how to bake. Sophie talked non-stop, asking Vivian questions about her job and her apartment and whether she'd ever met anyone famous. Ethan watched them, watching the way Vivian engaged with his daughter, asking follow-up questions and listening like Sophie's answers actually mattered, and he felt something shift inside him, something that felt dangerously close to hope. After lunch, Sophie asked if she could explore the apartment, and Vivian said yes. When she was gone, Vivian turned to Ethan. "She's wonderful." "Yeah, she is. Thank you for bringing her. I know that wasn't easy." "It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what you said, about there being room for both." "And?" "I think you might be right." He took a breath. "I'm not saying I have it all figured out, but I want to try. If you're willing to be patient with me." Vivian smiled, and it was the most genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I can be patient." Sophie came running back onto the balcony, holding something. "Ms. Ashford, you have a piano. Can I play it?" "Of course." They went inside, and Ethan watched Sophie sit at the piano and start picking out a simple melody. Vivian stood next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "This could work," she said quietly. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I think it could." The months that followed were messier than Ethan expected. Not bad, just complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. Dating your boss turned out to be exactly as awkward as it sounded, especially when you were trying to keep it quiet from an entire company full of people who lived for gossip. They were careful at first. No public displays, no lunch dates where coworkers might see them, nothing that would give anyone ammunition. But careful only went so far when Sophie started asking why Ms. Ashford came over for dinner every Thursday, or when Marcus caught them leaving the office together 3 times in 1 week and raised an eyebrow that suggested he knew exactly what was going on. "We should tell people," Vivian said one night. They were at Ethan's house, sitting on the couch after Sophie had gone to bed, and Vivian was leaning against him in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. "Tell them what exactly?" "That we're seeing each other, that this is real." Ethan's stomach tightened. The board's going to have opinions. "Let them. I don't report to the board when it comes to my personal life." "You kind of do, though. They can make this really difficult if they want to." She sat up, turned to face him. "Are you ashamed of this?" "What? No." "Then why are you so afraid of people knowing?" He didn't have a good answer for that. Or rather, he had several answers, none of which made him sound like anything other than a coward. He was afraid of judgment, afraid people would think he'd slept his way into his position, afraid that going public would somehow jinx the fragile thing they'd built. "I just want to protect what we have," he said finally. "I know, but hiding it isn't protecting it. It's just making us both miserable." She took his hand. "I'm 42 years old, Ethan. I've spent my entire adult life worrying about what people think, making decisions based on optics instead of what I actually want. I don't want to do that anymore, especially not with you." He looked at her, at the way she was watching him with that mix of hope and frustration, and realized she was right. They couldn't keep living like this, sneaking around like teenagers, pretending at work that they were nothing more than colleagues. "Okay," he said. "We'll tell people." "Really?" "Yeah, but let's start small. Marcus first, then the team, then we'll figure out how to handle the board." Vivian smiled, kissed him, and Ethan tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. They told Marcus the following Monday. Ethan asked him to lunch, and they went to a deli down the street where the noise level made private conversations possible. "So what's this about?" Marcus asked, biting into his sandwich. "Vivian and I are seeing each other." Marcus stopped chewing, stared at him. Then he swallowed and said, "No shit." "You knew?" "Ethan, everyone knows. Or at least suspects. You two aren't as subtle as you think you are." "Great. Hey, I'm not judging. She's been different since you showed up. Less," he searched for the word, "robotic, more human. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. "You really think people won't care?" "Some will. There's always going to be assholes who think you got your job because you're sleeping with the boss. But the people who matter know you earned your spot. The platform redesign proved that." Marcus took another bite of his sandwich. "Just don't screw it up. I like you, but I like her more. And if you break her heart, I'll make your life hell." Noted. They told the engineering team the following week in a brief, awkward announcement at the end of a regular meeting. Most people seemed unsurprised. A few offered congratulations. One guy made a joke about mixing business with pleasure that earned him a death glare from Marcus. The board was harder. Vivian scheduled a private meeting with the chairman, a man named Richard, who'd been with the company since before Ethan was born. She asked Ethan to come with her, and they sat in Richard's corner office while he listened to Vivian explain the situation with an expression that gave away nothing. "I appreciate you telling me this directly," Richard said when she finished. "But you understand this puts us in a difficult position." "How so?" Vivian's voice was calm, but Ethan could hear the steel underneath. "Ethan reports to you. That's a clear conflict of interest. If anyone ever accused you of favoritism, of giving him opportunities he didn't earn, then they'd be wrong. Every promotion, every project I've given Ethan has been based on merit. His performance speaks for itself." "I believe that. But perception matters. And the perception of the CEO dating a direct report is problematic." Ethan spoke up before he could stop himself. "Then I'll transfer to a different department, report to someone else." Richard looked at him, surprised. "You'd be willing to do that?" "If it means Vivian doesn't have to choose between her job and her personal life, yes." Vivian turned to him. "Ethan, you don't have to." "I know, but I want to." He looked back at Richard. "I love my job, but I'm not going to let it cost her everything she's built. So if reporting to someone else solves the problem, that's what we'll do." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me discuss this with the board. We'll figure something out." They left the office, and Vivian was silent until they got to the elevator. Then she turned to Ethan and said, "You didn't have to offer that." "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because you took a chance on me when no one else would. Because you've given me back a part of myself I thought was gone. And because I'm not going to let loving you cost you something you've worked your entire life for." Vivian's eyes went wide. "You love me?" Ethan realized what he'd said, felt his heart kick up. "Yeah, I do." She kissed him right there in the hallway, not caring who might see, and Ethan kissed her back, feeling like maybe they were going to be okay. The board's solution, delivered 2 weeks later, was to restructure the engineering division. Ethan would become Chief Innovation Officer, a new position that reported directly to the board instead of to Vivian. It came with a raise, more responsibility, and the kind of visibility that made Ethan want to hide under his desk. "This is a promotion," Vivian said when she told him. They were in her office, the door closed, and she looked genuinely happy for him. "You deserve this. I don't know if I'm ready for it." "You've been ready since the day you walked in here. You just didn't believe it yet." She came around the desk, sat on the edge in front of him. "Chief Innovation Officer Ethan, that means you'll be leading development for every new technology we pursue. The board wants you to build a team, set the direction, shape the future of this company." That's terrifying. Good. That means you'll take it seriously. He looked at her, at the pride in her face, and felt something settle into place. Okay, I'll do it. Good. Because I already told them you'd say yes. He laughed despite himself. You're impossible. You love me anyway. Yeah, I really do. The transition into the new role was brutal. Ethan had to build a team from scratch, establish protocols, navigate company politics he'd successfully avoided until now. There were days when he came home so exhausted he could barely function. Days when Sophie had to remind him to eat dinner because he'd been staring at his laptop for hours without noticing the time. But Vivian was there through all of it, offering advice when he needed it, calling him out when he was overthinking, reminding him that he was allowed to ask for help. And slowly, painfully, Ethan started to believe he could actually do this. 6 months into the new position, he hired a young engineer named Maya who reminded him of himself at that age. Brilliant, insecure, trying too hard to prove she belonged. He gave her a chance on a project everyone else thought was too risky, and she delivered results that blew away every expectation. Watching her succeed felt like closing a circle, like finally understanding what Vivian had seen in him that day on the highway. Sophie was thriving too. She'd started calling Vivian by her first name instead of Ms. Ashford, had stopped drawing pictures of imaginary families and started drawing pictures of the three of them together. One night, while Ethan was tucking her in, she said, "Dad, is Vivian going to be my mom now?" The question caught him off guard. Would you want that? I don't know. I like her, but I don't want to forget my real mom. You won't. Your mom will always be your mom. Nothing's going to change that. He sat on the edge of her bed. But Vivian could be someone else who loves you, someone who's there for you. You don't have to call her mom if you don't want to. She can just be Vivian. What if she leaves? She's not going to leave. How do you know? Ethan thought about it, about all the ways people could leave, through death, through choice, through 1,000 small betrayals that added up to absence. I don't know for sure, but I trust her. And I think you can too. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, I like her being around." Me too, Bug. The following spring, Ashford Dynamics launched a new electric SUV platform that incorporated technology Ethan's team had developed. It was the most efficient vehicle the company had ever produced, and the early reviews were glowing. The automotive press called it a game changer. Dealers couldn't keep them in stock. The launch party was held at the same hotel where the gala had been, and this time Ethan walked in without the crushing anxiety that had defined that first event. He brought Sophie, who wore a dress she'd picked out herself, and spent the entire evening charming board members and executives with stories about her dad. Vivian gave a speech crediting the innovation team, specifically mentioning Ethan by name, and the applause that followed felt genuine. Afterwards, people came up to congratulate him, to shake his hand, to tell him they'd known he had it in him all along. Marcus pulled him aside near the end of the night. "You did good, man. Really good. Thanks. Couldn't have done it without you pushing me." "Yeah, you could have, but I'm glad I got to be part of it." He glanced at Vivian, who was talking to Sophie across the room. "She's good for you. You're good for her. Don't screw it up." "You've told me that before." Bears repeating. Later, after the party ended and they dropped Sophie at Mrs. Chen's for a sleepover, Ethan and Vivian went back to her apartment. They stood on her balcony, looking out at the city, and Vivian leaned against him. "A year ago you were fixing my car on the side of the highway," she said. "Feels like a lifetime ago. Does it feel real yet? Everything that's happened?" Ethan thought about it, about the job, the success, the relationship, the life he was building. "Sometimes. Other times I still feel like I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It's not a dream." "I know, but I spent so long thinking I didn't deserve good things that it's hard to accept them when they show up." Vivian turned to face him. "You deserve all of this, Ethan. The job, the recognition, the happiness. You've earned it. So have you." "Yeah, I think maybe I have." She smiled. "I was so focused on being successful that I forgot what I was being successful for. And then you showed up and reminded me that there's more to life than quarterly earnings and board approval. I didn't do anything. You were yourself. That was enough." They stood there for a while, just holding each other, and Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the absence of struggle or fear or doubt, but the presence of something stronger, the knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. A year later, Ashford Dynamics went public with the news that they were opening a new research facility dedicated to sustainable automotive technology. Ethan was named director, a position that came with unprecedented autonomy and resources. The press coverage was extensive, with multiple outlets running profiles on him, the engineer who'd disappeared for 6 years and come back to revolutionize the industry. He did the interviews because it was part of the job, but he hated every minute of it. Talking about his past, about Emily's death, and his years in the wilderness felt like exposing wounds that had finally started to heal. But Vivian reminded him that his story mattered, that there were probably other people out there who'd walked away from their dreams after tragedy and needed to know it was possible to come back. One interview in particular stuck with him. The journalist asked, "What would you say to someone who's given up on their career, their passion, because life got too hard?" Ethan thought about it for a long time before answering. "I'd say that giving up isn't failure. Sometimes stepping back is the only way to survive. But I'd also say that you're allowed to come back, that the person you were before the trauma doesn't have to stay buried. It takes time and help, and a lot of courage to believe you deserve a second chance. But you do. We all do." The journalist published that quote as the headline, and Ethan got letters from people all over the country telling him it had meant something to them. He kept every single one in a folder on his desk, reading them on the days when he still doubted himself. Sophie turned 7, then 8. She started playing piano seriously, taking lessons from a teacher Vivian had found. She made friends, did well in school, grew into a kid who was confident and curious and kind. She still missed her mother. There were nights when she'd cry and ask questions Ethan couldn't answer, but she'd also learned that grief and joy could exist in the same space, that remembering the past didn't mean giving up the future. Vivian became a constant in their lives. Not a replacement for Emily, but something different. Someone who showed up for Sophie's school plays and helped with homework and taught her how to negotiate for a later bedtime with arguments so persuasive that Ethan usually lost. Someone who'd take Sophie on weekend outings so Ethan could have a few hours to himself, then come back with stories about museums and parks and ice cream shops they'd discovered. One Saturday afternoon, about 18 months after that first dinner at Vivian's apartment, Sophie came home and announced, "Vivian says she wants to marry you." Ethan, who'd been making lunch, nearly dropped the knife he was holding. "She what?" "She said she's waiting for you to ask, but you're taking too long and she's getting impatient." Sophie, did Vivian actually say that? Not in those exact words, but I could tell that's what she meant. Ethan found Vivian in the living room, looking entirely too innocent. "Did you tell my daughter you want to get married?" "I told your daughter that I love you and that I'd like our relationship to be permanent. She inferred the rest." "You're using my 8-year-old to pressure me into proposing? Is it working?" Ethan sat down next to her, took her hand. "I want to marry you. I've wanted to for months, but I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong." "Like what? Like what if Sophie decides she doesn't actually want you as a permanent part of her life? What if the novelty wears off and she resents you? What if I'm not good enough at balancing work and family and I end up failing at both?" Vivian squeezed his hand. "Ethan, you've been balancing work and family for 2 years now, and you're doing fine, better than fine, and Sophie adores me. She literally just told you I said I wanted to marry you, which I didn't actually say, so clearly she's on board with the idea. You're really okay with this? With taking on a ready-made family?" "I'm not taking on anything. I'm joining something that already exists." She moved closer. "I love you. I love Sophie. I love the life we're building. And yes, I want it to be permanent, but I'm not going to push you into something you're not ready for." "I'm ready. I'm just scared." "Good. So am I. That means it matters." He kissed her, and Sophie yelled from the kitchen, "Does this mean you're getting married?" "We're discussing it," Ethan called back. "That's a yes. I'm going to tell Mrs. Chen." Ethan proposed properly 3 weeks later with a ring he'd spent 2 months picking out and a speech he'd rehearsed so many times he could recite it in his sleep. They were at the park where he used to take Sophie when she was little, sitting on a bench while she played on the swings, and Vivian cried when he asked, which was something he'd never seen her do before. "Yes," she said, laughing through the tears. "Obviously, yes." They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony with just close friends and family. Sophie was the flower girl. Marcus was Ethan's best man, and the whole thing was so perfectly imperfect. Someone's phone went off during the vows. Sophie tripped on her dress walking down the aisle. Ethan forgot his line and had to be prompted by the officiant that it felt exactly right. At the reception, Vivian gave a toast that made half the room cry. She talked about finding Ethan on that highway, about taking a chance on someone who didn't believe in himself, about learning that success meant nothing if you didn't have someone to share it with. I spent 40 years thinking I had to do everything alone, she said, that needing people was weakness, that vulnerability was failure. And then I met a man who was stronger than anyone I'd ever known, not because he had all the answers, but because he was brave enough to keep going even when he didn't. He taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, that starting over isn't giving up, that love doesn't make you less capable, it makes you more whole. She raised her glass. To Ethan, who saved my life by letting me save his. Ethan couldn't speak after that, just held her hand and tried not to fall apart in front of everyone. 2 years into the marriage, the research facility Ethan directed produced a breakthrough in battery technology that cut charging times in half. The achievement made international news, won awards, positioned Ashford Dynamics as the leader in sustainable automotive innovation. Ethan did interviews, gave speeches, accepted accolades, and through all of it, he kept waiting for the imposter syndrome to kick in. It never fully went away, but it got quieter. Sophie turned 10, announced she wanted to be an engineer like her dad, and started spending weekends in his home office, asking questions about how things worked. Watching her curiosity, her fearlessness, her absolute certainty that she could build anything if she tried hard enough, Ethan saw pieces of both Emily and himself, and it didn't hurt the way it used to. One night, tucking her in, Sophie said, "Dad, do you think Mom would have liked Vivian?" "Yeah, Bug. I think they would have been friends." "Good, because I think Mom would be happy that you're happy." "Where's this coming from?" "I don't know. I was just thinking about her today, about what she'd think of everything now." Sophie played with the edge of her blanket. "I can't remember her voice anymore. Is that bad?" Ethan's throat tightened. "No, it's not bad. It's just what happens with time." "Do you remember it?" "Sometimes. Usually when I'm not trying to." "Do you still miss her?" "Every day. But it's different now. It doesn't hurt the same way it used to." "Because of Vivian?" "Partly, but also because I learned that missing someone doesn't mean you can't build a new life. That loving someone you lost doesn't mean you can't love someone new." He kissed her forehead. "You're allowed to love both of them, Sophie, your mom and Vivian. There's room for both." She hugged him tight, and Ethan held her, thinking about how much had changed since that morning on the highway. How the man he'd been then, broken, hiding, convinced his best days were behind him, wouldn't recognize the man he'd become. On their 3rd anniversary, Vivian surprised him with a trip. Just the two of them, Sophie staying with Mrs. Chen for the week. They went to a cabin in the mountains, no cell service, no work, nothing but time and each other. On the last night, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Vivian said, "Do you ever regret it? Taking the job, getting involved with me, all of it?" "Never." "Why?" "I don't know. Sometimes I worry that I pushed you into a life you didn't want, that you were happy fixing cars and I dragged you back into something that might have been better left alone." Ethan turned to look at her. "You didn't drag me into anything. You offered me a choice, and I chose this. I'd choose it again, even with all the pressure, the expectations." "Even with all of that." He took her hand. "You know what the hardest part was? Not the work, not the scrutiny, not even the fear of failing. It was believing I deserved to be happy again, that I was allowed to want things beyond just surviving. And now I know I deserve it, because you showed me I did, and because Sophie needed me to believe it so she could believe it too." He kissed her hand. "You gave me my life back, Vivian, not just the career stuff, all of it, the ability to hope, to trust, to imagine a future that doesn't end in loss. That's not something I'll ever regret." She leaned against him, and they sat there as the sun dropped below the mountains, painting the sky in colors that looked impossible but were absolutely real. 5 years after Ethan first walked into Ashford Dynamics, the company was ranked as the most innovative automotive manufacturer in the world. The research facility he directed had produced 17 patents, launched 4 new product lines, and trained a generation of engineers who were changing the industry. Ethan's name was on conference programs and advisory boards and shortlists for awards he'd never imagined winning. But the thing he was most proud of had nothing to do with patents or products. It was Sophie, now 12, confident and brilliant and unafraid to take up space in the world. It was the home he'd built with Vivian, messy and imperfect and filled with laughter. It was the way he'd learned to carry grief without letting it define him, to honor the past while building the future. One afternoon, sitting in his office reviewing a proposal from Maya's team, Marcus stopped by. "Got a minute?" he asked. "For you?" "Always." Marcus sat down, looked around the office with its awards and photos and the whiteboard covered in equations. "Remember that first meeting when I thought Vivian had lost her mind hiring you? I remember you testing me every chance you got." "Yeah, well, I was wrong. You're the best thing that happened to this company." He paused. "You're also the best thing that happened to Vivian. She's different now, more human, less—" He searched for the word. "Terrifying?" "I was going to say alone, but yeah, also less terrifying." Ethan smiled. "She did the same thing for me. Made me remember I was more than just Sophie's dad, more than a guy who couldn't handle his grief." "You two are disgustingly good for each other." "Thanks, Marcus." "Don't mention it. Seriously, don't. I have a reputation to maintain." He stood. "But for real, man, I'm glad you took the chance. On the job, on Vivian, on yourself. You earned everything you got." After he left, Ethan sat there thinking about chances, about the ones people took on you and the ones you took on yourself, about how the hardest part of starting over wasn't the work or the fear or even the grief. It was believing you deserved to try. That night, he came home to find Vivian and Sophie in the kitchen making dinner together, or trying to anyway. There was flour everywhere, something was burning in the oven, and they were both laughing so hard they didn't notice him at first. "What's going on in here?" he asked. "We're making you a birthday cake," Sophie said. "My birthday's not for 2 months." "We know. We're practicing." Vivian pulled something blackened out of the oven. "This is attempt number 3. The first 2 were somehow worse." Ethan looked at the disaster zone that used to be his kitchen, at his daughter covered in batter, at his wife holding a smoking cake pan, and felt something so big he couldn't name it. Joy, maybe. Or gratitude. Or just the simple, profound knowledge that this was his life now, and he got to keep it. "I love you both," he said. "We love you too," Sophie said. "Even though you're interrupting our very important work." "My apologies, carry on." He watched them try again, watched them fail again, watched them laugh through the failure and decide to order pizza instead. And he thought about the man he'd been on that highway, certain he had nothing left to give, convinced the best parts of his life were over. That man had been wrong about so many things. Because the truth was, the best parts weren't behind him. They'd been waiting for him all along on the other side of fear and grief, and the terrible, necessary work of believing he deserved another chance. They'd been waiting in the form of a woman who saw him when he couldn't see himself. A job that reminded him who he used to be, a daughter who needed him to be whole so she could learn to be whole too. The best parts were here, now, in this messy kitchen with these messy people he loved more than he'd thought it was possible to love anything. And they were just beginning. Looking back now, Ethan understood something he hadn't that morning on the highway, that broken things could be fixed, that lost people could be found, that the end of one story didn't mean there couldn't be another, different and better and more true. All it took was someone willing to stop and help when you were stranded. Someone brave enough to believe in you when you'd stopped believing in yourself. Someone patient enough to wait while you figured out that starting over wasn't giving up. It was giving yourself permission to live again. Vivian had given him that permission. And in accepting it, in choosing to try, he'd discovered that second chances weren't just about getting back what you'd lost. They were about building something new from the pieces that remained, something that honored the past without being trapped by it. Some people spend their whole lives looking for that kind of grace and never find it. Ethan had found it on the side of a highway, in a woman who needed a sandwich and a ride, and ended up giving him so much more. He'd found it in the choice to trust again, to love again, to believe that even after everything, he was still allowed to want things. And wanting things, it turned out, was where the real living began.